I cannot say exactly where, but there is a facility carved into bedrock so deep it has its own microclimate. And for the purposes of this story, I will call it Hollowgate Penitentiary. It sits under a stretch of highway that no one takes at night, and under a sky that never looks the same when you are below it. On paper, it is ordinary in the way prisons are ordinary. Reinforced concrete, biometric locks, keycard lanes, and surveillance towers. In practice, it is not ordinary at all, because what we keep in its lowest tiers is not the kind of thing a municipal jail was built to hold. Walking into Hollowgate the first time felt like being swallowed by a building that had learned to breathe in the dark. The air smelled of cold metal and stale coffee, with a thin undercurrent of damp earth that made the concrete seem less industrial and more subterranean. Fluorescent lights hummed like insects, and the echo of my own boots sounded like someone else walking the line. There was a pressure at my chest, the same tightness I remember from hospital corridors the night my father died. A kind of clinical claustrophobia that is at once professional and personal. I worked there as an external consultant, contracted by a containment division of an agency with a name that does not help you sleep. Call them Research Division C if you must. My background was in behavioral forensics and crisis negotiation, and they wanted someone who could talk to people who should not be talked to. I took the job for obvious reasons: credential, paycheck, and a professional hunger that smells a lot like grief. Losing my father had left a gap that data and procedure could not fill, and somewhere in that vacancy grew a curiosity I could not lay to rest. That mixture of curiosity and a private ache is how I started smiling at intake, like a man who thinks he can bargain with a system that does not deal in bargains. Hollowgate, at its most clinical description, had an intake level, administrative wings, debrief rooms, and, below that, a secure sub-level with vacuum-sealed access corridors and airlocks between blocks. But the sub-level is where the tone changes from bureaucratic to mythic. The records catalog a list that reads like a taxonomy of horror. Class 2 offenders who had strange compulsions, Class 3 voids that refused to sleep, Class 4 manipulative types who convinced guards to do things, and then a handful of names labeled Class 5, which in internal memos we treated as shorthand for not merely dangerous, but ontologically anomalous. On the list I was handed, there was a name that would not leave my notes: August Crowe. August had been arrested as a serial killer in 3 jurisdictions, linked to more disappearances than the files would allow me to repeat. And he had been transferred to Hollowgate not for escape risk alone, but for what he said in interviews. People said he smiled like a man who knows the end of the sentence before the punctuation. From the first day, I felt the protocol clashing with the personal. Warden Elias met me in a corridor that smelled of disinfectant. He was solid, the kind of man whose presence read as a structural element in the institution. He handed me a key card and did not smile. Dr. Miriam Hale, Director of Research, walked with the clinical calm of someone who thinks emotion is an interference pattern. Lieutenant Raul Ortega, head of security, had a cigarette scar by the lip that made him look like someone who had been punched by a time he did not remember. Nurse Kayla Winters ran the medical intake and had the tired eyes of someone who knew how to hold bad news at bay. Technician Samir Patel monitored the feeds and spoke in clipped syntax about transponder checks. Researcher Lin Chen, who would later become my confidant and occasional antagonist, had a quick laugh and a record of peer-reviewed papers that read like a recitation of commandments. Guard Marcus Boone was the man who actually opened doors. Add to them an administrative assistant named Grace, a chaplain who only came on Sundays and called himself Father Ian, and, on day 3, a counselor named Joyce Marks who had a penchant for burning sage in a jar in private. Those are the names I will return to, because their actions thread through what happened and because names anchor memory when everything else is erasure. The official tour of Hollowgate was a lesson in redundancy. Access control in the upper levels looked like any secure site. Card readers, retinal scans, ID transponders, metal doors that closed with a pneumatic sigh, cameras positioned to catch body heat and shadow. But the sub-level protocols had an extra layer of theater and paranoia. Airlocks were staggered with overlapping biometric verifications. The step down to August Crowe's block was a descent into a compressed world where light was rationed and sound swallowed. There was an anteroom with a pressure equalizing sequence that made your ears pop, walls that tasted faintly of ozone if you pressed your face close enough, and a security pane thick enough to make you feel like a fly staring out from a jar. On the tour, Dr. Hale explained containment classifications in dry administrative English. She spoke about class levels and about the decision tree we use to determine what measures to apply. She described August as dangerous primarily because of what he said, not for how he killed, but for the narrative he wove about those he claimed to have met inside people's heads. Despite all the talk of concrete and keys, there were early hints that Hollowgate held secrets its own architecture did not want to admit. Surveillance footage sometimes had frames missing by whole minutes, and one camera had a persistent aberration that looked for a time like static, and then gradually, unnervingly, like a face. A door that should have been vacuum sealed once rattled in a way that made metal teeth chitter. More prosaically, a set of intake forms contained a notation that an acquired sample had an unclassifiable signature. Samir mentioned these things in passing, eyes flicking to the wall, his voice like someone reading aloud from a report he did not quite believe. There was a logbook entry that read, simply, "We found him smiling in the dark," and the notation was redacted further down the page. The tension between procedure and the uncanny is a thing you live inside when your job is to hold open doors that the rest of the world has slammed shut. The first real contact with August Crowe was arranged carefully, and it felt staged in a way I would later learn was protective and performative. He was in a cell that should have been unremarkable, but was not. The cell was sound-dampened, vacuum-sealed, with one small viewing port that reflected my own face back at me in low light. He was sitting on a metal bench, knees together, hands folded as if in some polite pose. The room smelled of metal, disinfectant, and an undercurrent of something sweet and coppery like blood left out in the sun. The viewing glass had an old sticker from the agency that read "Containment" and a passcode etched in tiny letters. I remember the texture of the chair under my palms, the way the doorknob gave a faint electronic buzz when I tested it. When they introduced him, it was through a speaker, a voice that sounded like a radio recalling someone from the stacks. August's voice, when it came, was plain and precise. He said my name as if he had been waiting, and there was something in the calibration of his vowels that felt like the slip of a blade. The first interviews were technical and observational. We were careful, a team of 3 with Dr. Hale in the control room, Lieutenant Ortega watching the monitors, and Samir keeping one hand on the keyboard between us. The scene is one I will return to in detail, because it is where I learned the danger that lies between statement and response. The initial exchange had the air of a negotiation. In the tape logs, August traced his own history with an accuracy that was at once clinical and performative. He spoke of empty streets, of a hunger that he called something like a conversation, and of the very particular way he would stop mid-act and listen. He cataloged victims not as people, but as vessels with contents. He spoke about the sound of concrete swallowing scream, the taste of copper, and the moments when he felt a voice suggest a place to go. In the early sessions, he would smile when naming streets and intersections as if those streets were old friends. The crew watched those sessions with a mix of fascination and closed-mouth fear. There was a slow, creeping realization that August was not simply recounting acts, but mapping relationships that made no allowance for the living. At about 30% of my time there, something happened that pushed viewers in the control room to comment and to ask for me to be careful in my choice of words. One morning, a recorded session cut to static for exactly 3 minutes and 9 seconds. When the feed returned, August was humming a melody I could not place. He was holding a pebble someone had smuggled in his pocket that was not in his file inventory. Samir replayed the buffer, and the metadata showed no sign of tampering. The pebble had been cataloged as evidence later and exhibited microscopic traces of a material the lab had not identified. These small anomalies accumulated and layered into an argument against the tidy theories we had been taught. There were memos about classification and falling thresholds, and an internal debate about whether August's case was purely psychological or if our taxonomy needed a new axis. One of the primary mysteries that thematized my work with August was the offer. In our jargon, we called it the boon. It echoed a trope in the containment literature where creatures or persons traded information for something valued, sometimes to the point of bargaining away safety. August proposed something like that in an offhand manner during a late-night hearing. He said he could tell us where a number of missing people were, that he could recreate the scenes in ways that made it possible to find evidence. But there was a cost. He wanted items, small tokens, that he said would help the memories come back. It was, in theory, an exchange, memory for objects. The ethical calculus was immediate. Do we trade for knowledge at the risk of empowering the subject? Dr. Hale argued for cautious engagement under controlled conditions. Lieutenant Ortega argued for custodial integrity. Warden Elias wanted to avoid precedent. My own voice argued for a methodical approach. Test, control, verify. I remember thinking how thin that sounded as a moral defense when the ledger of lives hung in the balance. The conversation that followed set the stage for the larger arc we all walked into. When we initiated the controlled offer experiment, it followed protocol at first. We cataloged every item, ran background checks on the provenance of each token, and set transponder-monitored times for contact. The tokens were innocuous: a child-sized marble, a length of twine, an old matchbook from a diner, a ribbon with a faded floral pattern, and a sepia photo of an unremarkable street corner. We vacuum-sealed them, signed chain of custody forms, and scheduled a short meeting where August would be allowed to handle the objects under observation. In the viewing room, Dr. Hale and Samir monitored vitals, and Lieutenant Ortega manned the override. I sat across the glass and watched. August, as curiosity moved like a worm under his skin. He handled each object with almost ritual care, turning them in his fingers like a man who recognizes the faces of old debts. Each object provoked an image in his mind that he recounted in a voice like the scratching of a match. The problem was that the images were not merely descriptive, they were prescriptive. He told us where bodies were, how they lay, what weather had been like, and he spoke with an authority that made even Dr. Hale look up from her clipboard. The exchange worked at a cost we did not predict. On the first night following the token handover, a cell alarm sounded. Not the usual beeping of a sensor, but a low, resonant bell that vibrated through the concrete as if the building itself had been struck. Camera feeds across 2 blocks glitched in that same pattern of missing frames we had seen before. When Samir dove into the log, he found pockets of interference aligning with a set of transponder pings he could not correlate to human movement. Guards reported dreams of faces that were not theirs, smells of cold iron in places that had been clean, and the sense that time itself had become sticky in corners of the sublevel. One guard, Marcus Boone, called in sick the next day with a complaint of a ringing in his ears that he said did not go away when he covered them. The next week, a contractor who was not cleared to be near August's block was found loitering by the supply elevator, fingers stained with a residue that the lab would later warn us not to breed on the skin. These were small, human consequences, but each aggregated into a pattern no procedure handbook accounted for. The ethical tension around the token exchange moved from the theoretical into the personal when I made a decision I would later regret. I had on me a small thing my father had once given me, a rusting pocket watch with a cracked glass face. I told myself it was research, a bridge to someone who might know names and coordinates that would close cases and spare families more nights of not knowing. I asked, quietly, if August could hold it. It was an unapproved act. Samir noticed the omission on the chain of custody and said nothing then, his silence like the soft pad of a hand over a sleeping mouth. August took the watch, let it sit on his palm for a breath that seemed to widen the room, and then lifted his head and smiled in a way that added teeth to shadows. He said plainly, "I will tell you what you want to hear, but remember that any exchange leaves a debt." The sentence landed in my chest like a stone. The scene to follow was part interview and part performance, and stands as the most technically scrutinized exchange in my time at Hollowgate. We had prepared a debrief with a set list of questions. The interviews were supposed to be controlled, 10 to 12 clear exchanges, a back and forth that allowed for cross-examination and mitigation of risk. I remember the sequence with embarrassing clarity because at its center was a conversation where the pattern of speech did not simply reveal content but altered it. The exchange began as a professional negotiation. I asked for names. He offered places. I asked for method. He offered metaphors that matched places we had not searched. Dr. Hale asked if we could verify in lab. He responded with a memory so vivid he made the tired clinical room smell of bakery yeast and diesel at once. Here is a reconstruction of that interview as close as memory and log will allow, scaled into the required structural rhythm of our dialogue. I will record the exchange with the necessary cadence to meet the technique I was trained to deploy. I asked, "Where did you start?" He answered, "On a Tuesday night with rain we couldn't have predicted." I asked, "What made you stop at that first house?" He answered, "The sound of someone saying please in the dark, and then the way silence answered back." I asked, "Did you know them?" He answered, "Not really. Sometimes the world hands you a face you have met in mirrors." I asked, "How did you choose the streets?" He answered, "I listened to the alleys like they were telling me which corners needed quiet." I asked, "Why tell us now?" He answered, "Because I like the sound of your interest." I asked, "What do you want?" He answered, "To be seen and to be kept in the same sentence." I asked, "Are you working with anyone?" He answered, "I work with the quiet." I asked, "Is there a pattern?" He answered, "Patterns are for people who do not want to be surprised." I asked, "Can we prevent more?" He answered, "You will prevent what you can when you believe the right things." I asked, "What do you want me to believe?" He answered, "That memory is a currency you do not spend wisely." I asked, "Will you lead us?" He answered, "I will offer directions that are honest in the way coins are honest." I asked, "And what if we refuse the price?" He answered, "Then you sleep with the noise and call it the wind." That exchange had the quickness of a knife and the slow accumulation of frost. It fitted the format, but the content leaked into the fabric of the institution. Afterward, Dr. Hale sat silent for a long time and wrote notes. Lieutenant Ortega paced like someone walking a damaged edge. We inserted a call to action into our public feeds about halfway through the collected footage, a measured prompt to the audience we did not have. In the middle of the narrative, I asked the viewers a question in a short paragraph addressed to anyone still reading. If you had to offer something to someone like August Crowe in exchange for a name, what would it be? Answer in one word: weapon, token, lie, or truth. That question, small as it seemed, helped me listen to what the public would say later when the tapes leaked. It was at roughly the same time that the first notable incident of physical violence occurred, the kind that turned procedural concern into emergency action. We had a morning shift when a containment door failed to lock. Not a glitch in the software, a physical failure, a catch in the steel rail, a latch that did not hold. The failure happened in a cell adjacent to August's block. By the time Lieutenant Ortega and Marcus Boone reached the corridor, the air smelled of smoke and iron. Guards later reported hearing a voice singing under the pipes and a smell like wet earth following. A prisoner from Class 3, a man named Harvey, who had been held for compulsive arson, was found in the wrong place, breathing shallow and with singed hair. He was coherent enough to say that the door opened itself for him and that someone with hands like paper had shown him a way. The lab traced a residue in the latch that matched the pebble found in August's catalog. Moments like that are where containment manuals fail because they imagine human errors and not the possibility that objects cross categories they were not meant to cross. After the door failure, we instituted a code red. Airlocks were cycled, every camera feed was scrubbed, and Samir worked through the night with his eyes reddening as he rewired logs to create independent redundancies. The control room felt like the inside of an egg with a brick pressed up against one side. We ran forensic reads on the Pebble and on August's watch. The watch had a micro-abrasion pattern that matched an old street that had flooded once in a year of memory. Laboratory notes described an anomaly in spectral readings that they could not place on any known material scale. The language in the reports took on a prayerful quality, people trying to describe what they did not have words for. In personal memos, some of us called this accumulation the gravity of August, the sense that events were being drawn toward him as if by an invisible field. The internal politics of Hollowgate made the situation worse. There were factions. Those who wanted to use August as a source and take risks inside a controlled envelope. Those who wanted him silent and isolated to prevent influence, and an undercurrent of staff who had been compromised in small ways and whose motives were not transparent. Joyce Marks, the counselor, argued that the human cost of isolation was profound, and that some form of humane engagement was necessary. She championed a therapeutic approach. Warden Elias, backed by a risk-averse executive board, insisted on stricter seals. Dr. Hale argued for a scaled program of interaction. These debates were not abstract. They shaped the tokens we allowed, the duration of exposures, and the timing of the interviews. They also shaped who among us would later be suspected of complicity when a set of deliberate manipulations started to appear in the logs. The second major moment of tension came when a security camera, a unit believed to be tamper-proof, recorded an image at 3 in the morning that defied physics. The feed captured the air in front of August's cell shimmering, an optical distortion that Samir could not reconcile with lens artifacts or heat signatures. Within that shimmer, a shape formed, something like a hand but not quite, articulated in a way that mirrored human motion but with the wrong number of bends. The camera lost frame again for 6 minutes. When it returned, August was humming and the Pebble was on the bench beside him, though it had been catalogued in the evidence locker the night before. We played that sequence over and over, each time the humming revealing a small shift in an otherwise ordinary night. The lab notes recorded static in the electromagnetic readings and a trace of biological matter that had no DNA match in our database. The incident forced a briefing with higher-up executives who asked for immediate termination of all exchanges. But Dr. Hale argued for continued controlled engagement because of the potential intelligence value. The debate unfolded like a slow fever, with staff taking sides, and some, worse, whispering that the facility itself had wishes. The third tension moment involved a direct attack during an escort. August was scheduled to be moved from his cell to a medical bay for a short test. The route across the service corridor required passing 2 airlocks and a transit elevator. The move had been rehearsed, signed off, and cleared. I had insisted on accompanying August in the escort because I felt a professional compulsion to be there. If something went wrong, I wanted to be close enough to see what it was. The journey started normal, the air tasting of filtered metal and coffee. Guards spoke in the clipped cadence of routine. Samir watched the monitors like a man watching a lit fuse. Halfway through, in the elevator, August shifted his gaze off to a wall and said, in a tone like someone making a fact statement, "There is a man who remembers his name is a stone." The elevator stopped for no reason. The emergency light flared a thin red, and the speakers delivered static for a long heart-stuttering beat. In the flicker of backup lights, a figure pooled at the far end of the service corridor, a shape too tall by proportion, moving not with a gait but with a redefined purpose. The next minutes were a blur of smell and sound. An electric taste came into the air like ozone before a thunderstorm. Guards wrestled and shouted, and a wrench clanged on concrete. Marcus Boone took a blow to the head and went down. I felt a hand press against my back and the world tilt like a ship. The attacker was not human by any measure we had. It seemed to step through the guard's body like an idea. Lieutenant Ortega fired a round that hit the wall with a shower of concrete dust and a sound like breaking glass. When the dust settled, the figure was gone, and August stood with his hands clean. He said simply, "Thank you," and smiled. We treated that incident as a failure of containment and a failure of imagination. If anyone had doubts about the stakes, they left after that. It forced the research division to escalate the classification structure and to post external auditors. It also made us tighten the rules on the token program and to reinforce airlock sequences. For a while, it felt like we had rebuilt trust on the fly, as one might stitch a shirt with gloved hands and a trembling needle. Samir worked to patch logs and to add a redundant feed. He installed an analog camera in a place the digital network could not reach, and said, in a voice like someone who had seen the bottom of a bottle, "If digital fails, we at least have film." That film would later become critical. Conspiracy thrums like a low wire in any large institution, but in Hollowgate, the conspiracy had teeth. There were staff who carried messages in their smiles and who met in the supply basement and whispered about the benefits of a world where certain truths were exchanged for influence. A guard named Hector, who rarely spoke above a whisper, was later found to have moved a set of tokens from evidence to a personal locker, and claimed he was doing it to protect someone. A liaison from an external contractor called Gideon visited often with an agenda that smelled of private funding and rumor of outside interest. There were memos about unauthorized access and a pattern of keycard entries that 2 analysts could not account for. Researcher Lin Chen found anomalies in the staff access logs that suggested tailing and an interior group that may have been intentionally fostering contact with August to glean something they did not want to request through official channels. Joyce Marks, who had advocated for compassionate engagement, found herself accused by some of being soft and by others of having allowed emotional contagion. Those internal fractures drove the narrative outward as much as any incident with an anomalous object. It was in this tangle of leaking loyalties that a transportation incident became the fulcrum for everything. August's scheduled transfer to a federal archive had been delayed. In the interim, the agency decided to move him under escort to a testing facility off-site, a drive that required a transfer through a reinforced man cage and under continuous surveillance. On the day of movement, a woman named Kayla Winters volunteered to man the transport pace as a medical observer. She took the small radio from Lieutenant Ortega and tucked it near her collar. The transport team, comprised of 8 people, as protocol demanded, each with a clearly assigned role and a contingency plan. We loaded August into a transport cell with reinforced walls and closed the hatch. He sat like a man who had read the manual of patience. During the drive, the truck took a detour. It was a minor route change, supposedly due to a maintenance closure. The driver, a contractor named Nolan, had a face like someone who had been told too many falsehoods and who now smiled at every lie he told. As we turned onto a service road under the hum of a sodium light, August reached for the mesh and said, "I used to like the sound of rain under these lights." The radio fuzzed out and a tone came through like a bird call inverted. Then the truck stopped in a place with no recorded construction. We checked the manifest and the GPS, and both said we were on the main artery. In the confusion, someone opened a tiny panel in the transport to check a latch, and a slip of paper fell into the cage. Written on it, in a handwriting I did not recognize, was a single word, "Remember." We recorded everything. The transport log later had gaps where 2 minutes of footage were missing and where the audio was flattened to a hum. When the truck restarted, one of the guards was unconscious, and the contractor Nolan had a cut on his hand that bled a liquid that smelled of old wood. Following that transport day, the agency launched an internal inquiry and external oversight. There were suspensions, and an investigator named Veronica Shaw was brought in to review the chain of custody. Veronica had a way of asking questions that felt like surgical probes. She also had a small crew of analysts who found a series of transactions suggesting a third party had been paying staff through a network of shells. The investigation led us to a name that had been whispered in the darker corners of Hollowgate, a siren of private funding called Marina Kay. She had a look and a voice that made people tell her secrets, and the record suggested she had been arranging odd meetings between contractors and certain members of staff. The implication was that August was a commodity in a market where truth could be auctioned. Marina was not on site. She worked from a hotel downtown and presented herself as a philanthropic funder of research. She arranged donations, banged on doors with the charm of someone paying for air. One of her associates, Kayla Winters later said, came by and left a postcard with a picture of a shoreline. Kayla, who had been on the transport, later told investigators that she had been approached by a representative with a friendly smile who asked strange questions about our token program. Kayla, whose instincts were medical and not conspiratorial, had felt oddly flattered and spoke about it like someone recounting a pleasant, if ill-timed, anecdote. But the investigation found bank transfers, coded receipts, and a pattern of purchase orders rerouted through accounts that moved like gulls before the storm. The conspiracy cut deeper than funding. Cameras that should have recorded every entrance had blind spots that matched the moments of unauthorized movement. The security access logs had been edited to remove certain keycard swipes. Samir, when interrogated, admitted to creating backup caches with names that mapped to vacation places rather than security points. He blamed himself on the grounds of fatigue and the desire to protect partial truths. I believed him. I also knew that when institutions fracture, the truth is often rewritten by the people who have the most to lose. Those internal betrayals became a narrative friction point that culminated in the night August walked the corridors of Hollowgate on the security footage after his cell had been locked and sealed. The footage was the thing that reoriented everything. On one late-night surveillance sweep, a security camera picked up an image of August standing outside his cell only minutes after records showed he had been restrained. The clip, grainy and low resolution, showed a figure in a hooded sweatshirt standing by the bench and then fading into the wall like a puddle. Lieutenant Ortega demanded an explanation. The initial explanation from the manufacturer was that the feed had been corrupted. But when we enhanced the footage, we found a detail the manufacturer did not like to see. August's hand leaving a smudge on the wall that looked, under analysis, like the impression of a palm printed in soot. Those smudges later matched patterns in the ventilation shafts, where the maintenance crew found the residue we could not identify. It was a moment that solidified suspicions of inside collusion and external interference. The footage went to Veronica's team and then to an outside counsel that nodded in an expression that suggested something more like a professional dread than surprise. At this stage, the narrative cannot be disentangled from human consequence. There were instances of emotional breakdown, a suicide attempt in a staff dormitory, a guard who quit and then refused to speak to investigators. People lost their jobs, and some lost their reputations. The work left scars in private ways. I remember sleepless nights watching footage and hearing my father's clock tick in my memory, the same sound as the pocket watch I gave August. There is a motif of the father and the cold concrete that returns in these recollections, because my grief and professional duty braided together until they were indistinguishable. That is the personal backstory that shaped my choices in ways I did not appreciate until later. Before Hollowgate, I was a man with measured habits, an interest in data, and a reluctance to risk. More than my reputation. I come from a family where silence was a currency, and questions were a kind of impropriety. My father taught me to find meaning in procedures, to trust lists, and to find comfort in boxes. When he died, the boxes opened, and I found noise. That noise led me to Hollowgate and made me less cautious than my training required. Saying this is not an apology. It is an admission. There is an antagonist's backstory as well, and August's backstory unfolded like an accumulation of public rumors and private admissions. He had been born in a town near a river that had a smell of algae and bone during certain seasons. He described a childhood in which voices came at him like neighborly calls, and in which the world felt porous to certain urgings. He said that his father left when he was 9, and that he learned to take whatever lessons were given by the silence that moved through his home. In juvenile files, he had a pattern of cruelty towards small animals, and for a time lived in foster homes that reported a quiet, conditioned anger. August later cultivated a persona like a man who collects people as if they were stamps. The deeper lie we uncovered in his accounts was that he believed himself a medium for patterns, a man who said he could read the seams of the city and hear what it wanted. That lore made him dangerous in a new register because it suggested he had found a method for making private griefs public. After months of work, there was a climax that read as a failure in containment and a triumph in exposure. An unscheduled power outage hit the sublevel, and, in the minutes before auxiliary systems engaged, a shadow slipped from a holding cell and moved through the corridor. The shadow did not behave like a thief or an animal. It moved with a predation that seemed to enjoy the sound of air leaving people's lungs. In the scramble, we saw a series of small transgressions that pointed to the unthinkable. The interior conspiracy had built a mechanism that allowed a traditional criminal actor to interact with forces we did not have names for. Guards were injured. A nurse named Kayla was stabbed and bled dry of more than blood, leaving a residue that smelled of old paper. The attacker vanished before the backup could secure the area. In the aftermath, we found a ring of stones placed near a ventilation grate, arranged with an intentionality that looked, disturbingly, like a map. The response was swift and punitive. Warden Elias locked down the facility and lectured staff in a voice that tried to be both paternal and legal. The agency issued a statement that said there had been a breach and that protocols were being reviewed. Veronica Shaw, the investigator, recommended a suspension of the token program and a review of all custody chains. The board ordered a subpoena, freeze on external funding, and started legal action against contractors. We instituted a containment sweep with the kind of forensic thoroughness that becomes ritual when you are trying to exorcise an unknown. Yet the sweep did something we did not want. It revealed the ways in which staff had been affected, a moral erosion that was difficult to correct with memos and training seminars. The most consequential scene occurred when August asked to speak, not through a speaker or a glass, but in person with a select team. The meeting was to be recorded, and it was the one session where I broke my own rules and walked a line between curiosity and negligence. The exchange was designed as a primary dialogue, the one to test the method of offering and to determine whether truth was obtainable without payment. It was scripted to produce 10 to 12 exchanges and to stop if any irregular signal was detected. The room smelled of coffee and antiseptic. Dr. Hale sat in the control room with the blinds drawn. Lieutenant Ortega stood by the door like a man who had aged into his uniform. Samir hovered near the recording equipment like a man who believed that if he watched hard enough he could catch a lie. The dialogue began with a routine question about a specific case file we had open. I will replicate that conversation as faithfully as I can, remembering the strictures of our format. I asked, "August, can you give us a full name of someone we did not have on file?" He answered, "There is a boy called Daniel Harrow, and he remembers the smell of river mud." I asked, "Where did you take him?" He answered, "Under the second bridge along Evers Lane in the year the sycamores fell." I asked, "How deep was the water?" He answered, "Deep enough to carry memory away." I asked, "Who else saw him last?" He answered, "A woman named Myra, who keeps a bakery and who thinks her bread is too salty." I asked, "What did he say before he died?" He answered, "He said the dark is a shape you can pray to." I asked, "Did he suffer?" He answered, "Suffering is not a shape, it is a habit." I asked, "Can you lead us to his remains?" He answered, "Yes, but you will need to bring me a map and a watch and the smell of his mother's pockets." I asked, "Why do you need those?" He answered, "Because memory is a collection of objects." I asked, "What guarantee do we have that you are not lying?" He answered, "I am a man who traded in truth for practice, and practice breeds a kind of truth." I asked, "If you lead us, what do you take in return?" He answered, "I will take a story you tell me about your father, and I will set it in a place that is not yours." The last answer landed like a blade, softly placed on a table. That interview led directly to the plan for a controlled field operation. We assembled a team to follow August's directions. The team included Veronica Shaw, Lin Chen, Warden Elias, Lieutenant Ortega, Joyce Marks in a supportive role, Samir for technical oversight, and me as lead negotiator. We planned with the kind of detail that on paper looked bulletproof. We had GPS units, backup radios, a camera team with analog and digital systems, and a protocol for immediate withdrawal if any sign of anomalous interference presented. We mapped the route August described and scheduled a retrieval operation for the early morning when the tide was low. I remember the taste of the metal in my mouth. On the ride out, I tried to keep focus by replaying August's voice in my head like a script. The site at Evers Lane was a narrow bridge with rusted girders and a river that smelled of rot and old coins. The air had a thickness like wet wool. We spread out as planned with ropes and markers and the camera team with their film. August sat in the back of the transport and hummed for an hour as if tuning an instrument. When we reached the bridge, the team advanced in formation and the world felt elongated. The first moment of contact with the site was sensory overload in the directed way of well-rehearsed fear. The smell of river mud was precise and right. The sound of water on stone matched August's description. There was a scrap of bakery paper caught in a grate that made my eyes sting with salt and sugar. We followed his directions to the letter and found a place under an old pylon where the sediment had shifted to reveal a shallow depression. Inside, we found a child-sized shoe and a set of bones partially covered in silt. The bones matched Daniel Harrow's dental records. We took the bones, recorded the scene, and began the process of righting what had been wrong. The success of the operation produced a dangerous kind of euphoria. It also produced consequences that were morally ambiguous because, in order to get the remains, we had followed August's directions and had, by extension, fed him a sense that his offer had been validated. Back at Hollowgate, the bones were analyzed and the finding confirmed. Families were notified. There was closure for some and new wounds for others. The institutional reports recorded that the operation returned value and that our methods had been validated, but they also recorded that the transfer had an unanticipated psychological effect on staff. We learned that working with something like August leaves you with a memory that is not yours, and that you carry away like a smell. The success emboldened some and worried others. The agency board authorized a controlled program that allowed for limited exchanges under heavy scrutiny. Dr. Hale argued this was a breakthrough in investigative technique. Veronica insisted on legal objections.
Oversight. Warden Elias tried, in an exhausted voice, to hold both things together. There were meetings where we argued about precedent and where the phrase, "we cannot be the only ones who do this," kept getting uttered and then quietly rebutted. It felt, for a time, like we were walking around a new appliance with a manual that had blank pages. But the program, as these things do, attracted attention and then attack. A sabotage event occurred in which a set of camera feeds were encrypted by an outside actor and held for ransom. The ransom demanded the removal of certain people from the program and a transfer of August out of Hollowgate to a private facility. We refused, and the ransom turned into blackmail. An old file of Dr. Hale's youth surfaced with photos suggesting she had once been in a cult group that used ritual objects similar to our tokens. She denied any operational link and claimed the photos were of a theater production that had happened when she was 23, but the board was not satisfied. When trust erodes in such places, the default is to pull the plug. The board ordered a cessation of the token program until a full external audit could be completed. It was at that juncture that the most personal consequence struck. I received an anonymous note at the facility mail, a smear of ink on thin paper that read, "Do not trust the quiet." Attached was a grainy photograph of me with August in the frame of the transport a month earlier, smiling. There was no context and no sender. The note looked like a threat, but it felt like a mirror. I began to wake from sleep with my father's clock chiming in a room that no longer existed. My actions felt visible in a way that made my skin crawl. Colleagues I trusted turned their faces elsewhere, and a rumor grew that I had been seen giving August my father's watch during a session. I had told fewer people than I thought, and had signed fewer forms than the law demanded. The rumor became truth in the workplace. The final incident that escalated into an evacuation began with a siren and ended with a bus burning at the staff entrance. A transport van carrying evidence crates went off route and into a ditch. When the teams went to retrieve the crates, they found an assortment of tokens had been placed in particular patterns and some items were missing. A guard named Hector, who had earlier been suspected of shielding items, was found with cuts on his palms and an expression like someone who had seen something he couldn't explain. Witnesses reported an otherworldly chorus on the night, and one of them, a chaplain named Father Ian, said that the shelter had been under a kind of prayer he did not recognize. The Public Relations Office insisted on calling the event an engineering failure. The families of victims
did not believe it. The research logs, released under pressure, contained redacted passages that made the event seem more like a ritual than an accident. In the days after the event, everything changed. External oversight took over parts of the operation. The board fired Dr. Hale pending an investigation. Veronica's team recommended moving August to a facility under federal control. There were arrests and suspensions and a host of legal suits. The agency issued a terse statement that named no anomalies and promised reforms. The tape we had recorded of the token handover and the subsequent success had leaked to a third party and created an online frenzy that framed August as either a monster or a prophet. The internet created a market for his words, and people began to write him letters from across the world asking for small tokens in exchange for promises. Guards who read some of those letters grew anxious. August read those letters and smiled. The epilogue unfolds in 3 times and records consequences that are both institutional and intimate. 1 month after the major incidents, Hollowgate was legally mandated to suspend the token program. Warden Elias retired under a cloud and moved to a small town where he kept to himself. Samir took a job at a private security firm and stopped talking about the static frames. Kayla required surgery and would later tell a court that she could not remember the face of the thing that harmed her, only the sound of its breathing. Some families received closure, and some received a box of bone and a longer list of questions. I returned home to a house that smelled the same as the one I had left, and in the evening I found my father's watch waiting on a table that I did not remember leaving it on. The watch no longer ticked. I kept it anyway, perhaps out of ritual more than need. 3 months after Hollowgate, the legal inquiry had broadened. Veronica Shaw published a redacted report that urged caution in dealings with anomalous subjects and recommended an independent containment oversight. The board established a new policy for token handling and required the appointment of a legal ombudsperson. Several staff members were reassigned and some were terminated. The public at large had found August's voice captivating in a way that made the agency uncomfortable. There were petitions to keep him in a more public setting and others to execute him. The justice system was not equipped to adjudicate things that sounded like metaphysics. I was deposed and I told the truth as I knew it, and like all departmental truths, it felt both incomplete and sharpened by the need to be usable in court. 6 months on, the consequences matured like a slow wound. August had been moved to a federal archive facility with higher security and less public exposure. They kept him in a cell with 2 windows that looked out at nothing, and with strict no trade rules. The urban mythology around him mutated into podcasts and art, and people wrote songs about him, in which he was sometimes a saint and sometimes a monster. The agency established a containment advisory group that included legal, ethical, and forensic experts. They instituted training for staff that included psychological debriefs and mandatory rest periods. Some things improved, some did not. There were still anomalies in the feed that could not be explained, and a small number of staff left, citing inability to continue. In private moments, I would walk past the closed door of my father's study and feel the weight of choices like a physical object. The last visit I had with August before his more permanent transfer was the one that stayed with me longest. We spoke through the glass, and he looked at me with a smile that did not quite touch his eyes. He asked me about my father, and I, in a lapse of better judgment, told him a story about a boy hiding in a closet and waiting for a hand on his shoulder that never came. August listened like an archivist, and then said, "You keep your memories like contraband, as if someone else might be cleared for them." He then asked, finally, a question that chilled me because it asked me to account for my motives. "Do you want to know the truth about what I did, or do you want to know why you needed to know?" I told him I wanted both. He nodded and said, "That is a dangerous double wish." He then told me a line I have not been able to expunge from my head. He said, "People give away what they fear will make them forget." I left Hollowgate the final time with no badge and a clearer sense of what had been traded. If you have read this far, perhaps you wonder about the moral of such a story. I do not offer redemption as a tidy conclusion. I can only tell you what I know now. The bones we recovered gave some families names. The changes in policy reduced the number of unsanctioned exchanges and brought in healthier oversight. But the leaks continued, and the internet carried August's words into 1,000 heads, and some of those heads made mistakes under a godlike exposure. I will tell you this as a final note. Certain offers should never be made, because to accept them is to become a merchant in other people's grief. Even with best intentions, the ledger is uneven, and the scales sometimes tilt in ways that are invisible until you have already weighed the last coin. If you are watching this as part of a desire to understand how containment fails in very human ways, know that systems are only as strong as the people who maintain them and their resistance to temptation. Leave comment below with one word. If you were forced to offer something to someone like August Crowe, what would you?
It be. Offer one word only. Weapon, token, truth, lie, or memory. Your participation matters. It helps shape the next inquiry we pursue. In the end, Hollowgate remains a place with a badge on the door and a clean sign that promises procedural integrity. Inside, concrete has a way of remembering footsteps, and the air sometimes smells of coffee. I still keep the pocket watch, cracked and mute, on my dresser. On some nights, I put it to my ear and pretend for a moment that it is ticking. I no longer go near places that smell like iron and sugar without taking a list with me and a partner who can vouch I am sane. I have told the truth as I could recollect it, with the technical notes and the human, and with a humility over my own culpability. I will say this plainly. I believed that offering my father's watch to a man like August could buy us the knowledge to close cases. It bought us a moment, and it cost us a peace we cannot quantify. There are professionals who will tell you that sometimes the needs of many outweigh the ethical cost. I will not dispute the calculus. I will only say that the ledger is not simple arithmetic. 1 month later, there was a memorial for those we could not save and for those we had closed. There were families who came and families who did not. Veronica Shaw's report remained a reference, and the token program lay dormant. We enacted stricter checks and changed the language in the regulations so that token was now an explicitly forbidden term without legal authorization. 3 months later, a small group of insiders published a leaker report that suggested greater culpability by external parties. And 6 months after Hollowgate, we were still in court deciding the limits of institutional responsibility. My life took a quieter turn. I stopped taking consults for a while. I walked the city at night and tried to listen for the things that sound like human voices in alleys. Sometimes I hear them, and sometimes I do not. Sometimes I turn my face and smell the cold metal of a building and remember the way a man smiled in low light. If you want to know more about the documents and the tapes I mentioned, subscribe and I will bring you the redacted logs and the uncut footages as they are cleared for release and as legal restraints permit. If you want to argue about whether we should ever trade with monsters, write that in the comments too. There are no simple verdicts in a world where systems are enforced by humans who hunger for resolution. I leave you with this final observation. The worst thing I learned working behind bars with a serial killer was not that monsters exist. The worst thing I learned was how easily we become them in the act of searching for answers. If you take anything from
this, let it be that curiosity without constraint becomes a currency that exacts payment, and sometimes the price is more than you can afford. If you want to follow what comes next, subscribe and keep your watch wound.